Well, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce our next panel, we have the President and CEO of the Council of the Americas, Susan Siegel. Susan, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Eric. And before I go any further, I want to thank Eric and the entire team for putting together the 53rd Washington Conference. And maybe we could give them a round of applause. So it is my great pleasure. I also want to thank Secretary General Magro for being our wonderful host here today. And before we go any further, it is my pleasure to introduce two outstanding leaders in the world of finance, World Bank President David Malpass and the Inter-American Development Bank President Ilan Goldfajn. Now, you've read their bios, so I'm not going to talk about their backgrounds, but I do want to say that they both have something really fantastic in common. They both have public and private sector experience, and I think that that is critical as we look at the world going forward, that people that lead such august and important institutions share that common background. Now, our goal of our discussion today is to give some depth to the conference theme and to put the region's economic situation and future into the context of global reality. It has changed dramatically as we've seen the entrance of China into Latin America as such a huge investor, and also the challenges that confront Latin America: economic, social, growth, and of course, some of the old issues of how do you attract investment in terms of framework, rule of law, and I could keep going. With every challenge, however, comes an enormous opportunity. And today, I would really like to focus on those opportunities and the opportunity to capitalize on what's happening in the world and to really, how do we build Latin America and make it a stronger place, a stronger economy where the countries can really support their peoples. Now let me start with David Malpass. You are nearing the end of your tenure. Tell us what you've learned. I know your position was global, but I know you love Latin America because you used to be on our board. So tell us what you've learned as you leave your position about the opportunities and the challenges in Latin America.
Thanks, Susan. Hi, everyone. It's good to be at OAS and good to be with the Americas Society and Council of the Americas. So learned the huge challenges from the global economy. So if you're poor in Latin America, this is a very challenging time. I first went for the U.S. government to Latin America in 1984 to Honduras and to Guatemala. They were facing huge difficulties, but the world was in a strong upgrowth phase. We don't have that now, and the investment levels are really falling worldwide in the developing world. So I think what to learn is the urgency of finding a better balance within the global economy. This has to do with the high prices faced by people in Latin America as they've been bid up by the world. It has to do with the lack of new capital inflows that are coming in. You mentioned China, they're providing some, but rest of world not really. And so these are huge urgent challenges, and they go along with the trade challenges, climate, and the poverty challenges that the people face across the region. I would like to see more open discussion in the world that you can either call it the North-South debate or the inequality debate or the lack of growth. The lack of growth, because one of our concerns is that this period of very slow growth for the world economy looks likely to continue with in particular with underinvestment in the poorer countries. A logical way in a world of slow growth would be to put more money into those that can grow faster, those more in the lower half, but that's not what's happening. It's a giant concentration of capital at the top.
So how can the World Bank, IFC, support some of that capital going into Latin America and some of the large countries that really can make a difference to world growth?
I think there has to be a framework in the world to allow that capital to flow. So at the G20, at the G7, at the Development Committee of the World Bank, at the IMFC, we discuss how to get the world out of a slow growth phase so that there's more investment into Latin America, into the big economies, and very importantly, the smaller economies. As far as the World Bank, it's been a giant surge in our own, we've expanded by 35% in the COVID and the food crises of the world. And we are now in a position to sustain that massive expansion. And so that helps. But as you know, IBRD resources, that's the lending arm of the World Bank, are limited. And IFC itself is in an expansion phase, but that often goes to businesses that are either already in operation or can set up. And I have to say that's a slow process. Final point, we're working hard to enable the private sectors around the world. So a major World Bank group initiative is to do better with the actual rules and regulations in economies so that they can be more attractive to that foreign investment that might come in.
Thank you very much. So Ilan, I want to turn to you now. You are just months into your tenure at the bank, but you have a long history leading and thinking about your country, Brazil, but Latin America as a whole. You come to the position with a lot of ideas and objectives to empower the people and businesses and governments of the hemisphere to grow and develop. So what are your focus? What's your vision?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Susan, for that. Thank you, the OAS, for organizing this. It is interesting to start the job at the current moment. We have quite a bit of challenges. And if you ask me what is my main focus, is to really make a difference, to move the needle. We have been decades in Latin America, and you're right, I've been there in different, I call it different lives, public, private, in Brazil, out of Brazil, and there are a lot of issues that are still there, social issues. They are even more daunting now. But in addition, now we have global challenges, sustainability, pandemic, others. So how do we deal with them at the same time? So the only way we can think is a framework where you can scale and be effective. In order to scale, you have to focus. And in order to focus, you have to choose your priorities. So when I come to the IDB, there are a lot of priorities. You can have a lot of things you need to do. But if you're not able to decide what really you want to do, what are the priorities? Social, climate, infrastructure, digital and physical, those are priorities. If you cannot do that, then you have too many priorities, which means that you have no priorities. And even if you can scale and focus, if you're not effective, it's a major problem, because you have the scale, you're going to have the finance, but are you effective? We are too much concentrated on the amounts of dollars we lend. We lend 15 billion, 10 billion, 20 billion. In this country, we increase our lending for X. We need to concentrate on what these dollars are actually making. What is the end result? We need to concentrate on the effective impact targeting. We need to look at effectiveness in a very different framework. That's a cultural change, in my view.
So accountability for the projects that are being financed by the IDB, but also you mentioned scale. How do we get scale, Ilan?
Well, to get scale, you first, as I mentioned, you need to choose. Now, usually what happens in public sector is that you have too many goods. Everything has its fair reason to focus. But if you don't decide what has more reason, then you won't be able to focus. And if you don't be able to focus, you cannot scale. Second, the challenges both in Latin America from the structural issues we have, plus the global challenges that are coming in general, are such that the amount of resources you need are so large that we need to think how we can finance, how we can do that. When you get into the international institution and development bank, you talk about competition between other development banks and I think, well, we are the scarce resource. We have the financing in a world that needs trillions. What's going on? So I think we need to find a way to scale, to work together between the organizations, within the organization, between the private arm and the public arm, and very important, to be able to scale with the private sector. That multiply. And that seems easy to say, much harder to do. How can you attract the private sector? We are in a world where we're saying, well, we need to reform, we need to be more effective, we need somehow to guarantee, and the buzzword is the risk. Let's take the risk away. Well, take the risk away takes reforms, and reforms take time. Just by us guaranteeing, you're not reducing the risk, we're just re-risking, we're transferring risk. And that's fine, but there's a limit on how much you can transfer the risk. And we need to look at the scale and see if we do have the amount of resources we need, both public and private, to the daunting task.
I want to come back to that, but first I want to go back to David because I think it relates to my next question, China. So China is all over our hemisphere today. And they're coming and they're investing in projects, they're buying companies, and one of the things they come with are resources. Ilan, you just mentioned resources. And when you talk to many of the leaders in Latin America or the heads of companies, they say, gee, I'd much prefer have American or European investment, but they don't come with resources. So my question to you is, give us a little perspective on your view of China coming into the region and your perspective on, how can we create more public-private partnerships? I'm going to ask Ilan kind of the same question afterwards, to counter some of the Chinese investments and create alternatives.
I'll talk about the spectrum of activity. So in the 70s and 80s, there was a giant reflow of petrodollar recycling that was done through U.S. banks. So they could come into the region and make loans, sovereign loans to governments. That didn't work out well and ended in the Brady Plan, which I was involved in. And then there was a long period of workout after that. So so the composition of debt has changed massively over these 40 years. It used to be in the 1980s and into the 90s that there was mostly Paris Club debt. That was the official creditors that were members of the Paris Club. So that's a U.S. Export-Import Bank, the Commodity Credit Corporation, and some other lenders of the U.S., and then the equivalent in Canada and Germany and France. And so as there would be availability of lending both officially and through private sector, there was at least a goal in Latin America of having a hemispheric relationship. That I worked on the Enterprise for the Americas initiative in 1990 and 91. NAFTA and the free trade agreements were efforts to have I'll call it industrialized country capital come in. That dwindled down, and China saw an opportunity. They're using things that make it hard to restructure the debt once it goes, if it goes sour. So as Ecuador found in their restructuring in 2000, very difficult situation because the contracts with China, they'd under a previous administration sold forward their oil to Chinese buyers. China didn't even take the oil. It was sold on world markets by Chinese traders. And so but the contracts had non-disclosure clauses. So then as the new government came in and looked to restructure the debt, very hard to do that because the contracts are not available. So I wanted to go through that as background, that the power of, as we bring that fast forward to China's growing soft power that they're using now. One example of that is the buildup of swap lines. So China has the ability to have central bank swap lines that are very much a debt-like instrument, but it's not necessarily qualified as a debt instrument, and it seems as if it may be excluded at some times from a debt restructuring. So it basically creates an advantage within the capital stock of a country. And so those are expanding rapidly and being drawn on by the countries. And so it's innovative ways to get very large amounts of money into countries under duress, or when the countries are fragile. And so the countries like it, the governments like those loans, but then the consequences last years. So that gives context. And that goes along with China, as the second biggest economy in the world, is very ready to go into inter-trade relations. And their business people are very ready to travel to Latin America. You know, American business people are constrained by the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So whereas in the 1960s and 70s, American business people, men and women, would go into Latin America, that has greatly tailed off because of the legal jeopardy that people are put in through the legal system. And so other countries, and particularly China, don't have that constraint and are able to travel more freely, engage more freely with government officials and private sector officials to close the deals that are being done. So it's I think a big challenge for Latin America, big challenge for the industrialized countries of what do you want to do to change the system so that there can be a market-based system going forward in Latin America. That should be very important to the United States. You know, there used to be initiatives often. I mentioned the Enterprise for the Americas initiative. I was involved in the America Crece, the Brady Plan. And so there are periodically big pieces of outreach, the USMCA outreach to Latin America. And so we're at a very timely point for that, for the U.S. to, and broadly, it's Europe as well, Japan as well, to be, you know, Japan in the 1980s had massive outreach into Latin America, which was important as well, and that was welcomed by the region, but has been replaced now.
You're dating us, David.
Sorry.
With all this stuff.
But wait, it's really important to think through history. How did we have a period where Latin America felt more identified with industrialized countries' values and market-based system, private sectors, and is gradually losing that?
I agree with that completely, and I think one of the great things, if you really want to understand Latin America, you have to look at the continuum as opposed to just a fixed moment in time. So Ilan, you started to talk a little bit about public-private partnerships. How can we attract more investment in the region? And how does global trade also play into that? Can you talk a little bit about that for us?
When you talk to investors, both Latin American investors from the region, but also outside, and you ask them what you really need to invest more to be more present in the region. And they can say a lot of things, and they say, but the number one reason and factor they point is stability, rule of law. They can make calculations about the risk of their investment. But uncertainty, as we know, risk differs from uncertainty. Uncertainty is more difficult. Uncertainty about changing the rules, political instability. So what we can do as an international institution, as a regional development bank, is how can we help for the rule of law, create institutions? How can we promote trust? How we can, with our technical assistance, but also with our financing, generate the stability, both the economic stability, but also the political stability. If we focus in the right priorities, social now, for example, we will be able to also promote political stability. So institutions, rule of law, institutions means independent judiciary, but also independent agencies that look at the sectors. If you can promote that, you will be able to attract more resources. And if you are able also to promote these institutions and have rule of law, democracy, which are very related, you will have more political stability. Economic stability and political stability is, in my view, the number one factor to attract more capital. Second factor, I think we are in a world that is very polarized. Not only polarized politically, but also if you look at our countries, there are a lot of polarization. It is incredibly hard now to find the common ground, the dialogue. I think we have, as leaders, and IDB is one of the leaders, is to push for dialogue, to push for common ground. And a nice way to do that is to look at regional projects, regional integration. And here I'm not talking only about trade integration, which is essential for Latin America, which we just export 16% to the region and the rest.
Absolutely.
And Europe is larger than 50% and 60%. So there is trade, but there's integration with digital. Things go to the US to come back from one country to the other, just the internet. Electricity, we are not connected fully yet. Water, there are basins of water, we don't know who to go, we need to integrate. We have an opportunity with a regional Amazon program that we want to push. I just was in the cities of the Americas. We can have a program for the cities. So there are so many things we can do together, and that's a way to go forward in a world that requires public and private partnership, but requires us to do something with the current challenges.
I totally agree with that. So how do we begin to move that forward? Because if we can create more integration, not a new idea, this is kind of an old idea, if we can create more integration within the hemisphere, we become the most competitive hemisphere in the world. And we also solve the China problem because we become almost an integrated market. It has all kinds of implications also for movement of people. So how do we create leadership to make this happen?
I think that's part of the reforms. That's part of the reforms that we are talking about. It looks to me that our institutions were fought to have a bilateral relationship with the countries, sovereign relationships. You are there to solve, if you're the IMF, budgetary and balance of payments, IDB projects in the countries. We have our country strategies. Well, we have the comparative advantage and the mandate to think about the region. The governors are elected. The first mandate is to deal with their citizens. We have the mandate to think about the region. But I'm not sure we have the fully instruments or the way we think about deal with the region. Can we really have a regional fund with the guarantees coming from, not bilateral guarantees from federal, but it's harder to have it. We at the IDB have been doing very strong and deep country strategies, but have we done regional strategies? Have we made a list of regional projects and prioritized the projects? We need to rethink our institutions for regional integration.
So David, let's turn to that. One of the ways you can have more regional integration is supply chains. And you know, it used to be that we cared about price. Today, I think we care about security of supply chains almost more than anything else. So talk to us a little bit. How can we have a hemispheric supply chain?
Piece by piece. So digitalization is important, and it grows, I think, from opportunistically. So Panama has some opportunities moving into Costa Rica and providing the ACE service. The regulators have to allow it. So one of the things is to work with the rule of law so that people can experiment across borders. You know, a lot of the regulatory pressure is to stop is to protect your own in terms of self-sufficiency. One that I thought of as you were going through is Mexico is really important in this and their southern border. So, and there's been a shortage of integration from Mexico down into Guatemala to Honduras, but also even further on energy. Electricity was mentioned, but also simply on trade. The people benefit from trading with people inside their own country, but then also very much across borders. I wanted to mention central banks, or the importance of central banks within the stability that Ilan was talking about is really important. And so institutional strength within countries where, you know, you can see it across Latin America, country by country. They may have deep political instability, and yet somehow the country is surviving. And if you examine why that is, it often is an institutional structure that World Bank or IDB or others helped the country create long ago. Sorry, deep in history, but those institutions are holding in some of the countries. I wanted to mention harmonized tariffs, and then go back to your, so that's important. That means the computers that connect trade and the bills of lading across borders can at least talk to each other. And that's so World Bank works on regional projects in order to try to break through the barriers. So I wanted to talk about scale just very quickly. We're doing it almost sector by sector. So in solar power, we're doing scaling solar, which means once you've done one project and financed it with private sector outreach, that then brings down the cost and also allows you to do it. So looking for areas where you can do times 10 or times 100. Also, that applies to preparedness. One of the areas that we've been working on is catastrophe preparedness. Means you take some steps today that will save you money in the future, but the country has to be enabled or encouraged, incentivized to do that. And so Latin America is a prime spot where you can spread risk around multiple countries, and then investors are willing to pay more for diversified risk than for single country risk. And also, of course, our institutions scale by issuing bonds. So we are a giant, World Bank is a giant bond issuer, 60, 70, 80 billion dollars a year that is used as leverage for the projects. So from a scale standpoint, and one more point on that that's really important to the current debate is to do the de-risking or the blended finance that we are seeking. Concessionality ends up being at the core. So what you're doing, and it was very well explained, is you're trying to find ways that you can take risk, de-risk, reduce the risk of a given project, and then spread that risk. And concessionality becomes vital in that. World Bank has proposed a trust fund that would be for middle-income countries, very relevant to Latin America, that would have concessional money that then would help make energy transitions that are not directly profitable, but with some added resources could be attractive to the private sector. So there's all sorts of innovations or efforts going on, but the shortage that is still, we just had our spring meetings, IMF and World Bank spring meetings, and one of the loud signals from the donors is they don't want to look at concessional resources at this point in time because their own budgets are strained. So one of the complications, and at the heart of this complication is if you're talking about global public goods, but you don't want to add any money to the system, who is going to pay for the global public good that you're trying to create, whether that's marine plastic reduction, as we are working actively on, or it's greenhouse gas reduction, or it's adaptation. I mean, in a way, it's a global public good if you can have adaptation that helps people prepare for a hurricane, because otherwise what they do is become migrants after the hurricane, and that's a big challenge. So we're looking for ways to add concessional resources for middle-income countries into global public goods.
That's a great idea, and very, very necessary. And Ilan, I'm sure you agree with that, but you've also talked a lot about, you touched on climate change, and you know, the clean energy transition. This costs billions of dollars. Talk about your vision, and maybe a little bit in the context of the things David just said.
So let me start with, agree with David. I think we have not yet solved the scale issue. We do know, and we have calculated the daunting task for climate, 1 trillion. If you include the structural issues in Latin America, the poverty, it adds up. So we know how much we need to do, but we have not yet figured out how we're going to scale it, how we're going to finance it. We can say, well, let's join effort. Yes, we join. Let's bundle with the private sector. Let's attract them. Yes. Let's de-risk, which basically means that we will transfer risk in a smart way so that you can bring more private capital. But there is a limit for all that. We need to make a calculation and say how much risk you can transfer, how much concessional money you can get so that you can help these transfers of risks. All of that needs to have a very clear figure so that we have a consistent plan for the future. I don't think we have it yet, but we are working. I think generally we are working on that. Part of the work is, yes, the innovations. In Latin America, because part of Latin America is financially advanced, and we can use the history with all the hyperinflation and all of that, there was need for a lot of financial. And when you look now, the innovations are coming from Latin America, coming with the IDB, part of it. The first debt to nature swap with the Barbados, we helped. The first sustainability-linked bond with Uruguay, where you can get lower cost if you reach your targets, climate targets, is there, so we can try to scale. They're all innovations that we can. There are a lot of countries coming to us and saying, I like the debt to nature swap, debt to climate swap. And I was thinking about it, why is the demand so large? Well, we have high debt and high demand for climate issues. Those are very important marriage now. And are we going to be able to scale that? Let's see. But I think the innovation is there. And last but not least, vision. I think Latin America has for long been portrayed by ourselves as the problems, that we need help with our problems. I think we need to look at it in a different lens. I think Latin America could be part of the solution, of the global challenges. And think about just two of them, climate change. I don't see other regions that can contribute more with clean energy. We already have one of the largest contributions from clean energy in the region. If you do it correctly, if you give the right incentives, you can generate actually export of that. So you can be part of the solution. Think about lithium for electric cars. We produce in Latin America 2/3 of the lithium. So again, it looks like the initial conditions are there for Latin America not to be part of the problem, but to be part of the solution. And in order to do that, you need to invest and have a clear vision. Food security. Latin America exports 40% of the export of commodities is in Latin America. If you do it correctly, you can multiply the amount of food you produce by 8 times. That's our research people have done. So also in terms of food security, Latin America is going to be part of the solution. Today, as you all know, poverty, food insecurity is a major issue.
So I am sorry to end this very interesting conversation, but Eric's giving me the evil eye over there. And so I want to thank David, Ilan, and I hope we can continue this conversation because this is a very, very important conversation. And I'm glad you got the last word in about Latin America being part of the solution, because I think we at the Council all believe that and want to work with both of you, both institutions, to try to make that a reality. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.